Hi Year 10, Mr. Tapley here for your next lesson of Year 10 History. At this lesson we are looking at developing our understanding of the 1958 Migration Act, so a law that changed the way migration occurred in Australia, and changes to not just Australian immigration, but citizenship, national citizenship, in 1973. And we're looking at those two events because they effectively led to the end of white Australia. That's our success criteria, to outline how those events contributed to the dismantling of white Australia policy. Post-World War II Australia, a changing nation. So it was becoming increasingly difficult for the government to justify a white Australia policy by the late 1950s. So when we created that white Australia policy, 1901, the birthplace of Australia, it made sense because everyone was white. White Australia policy, you look around, you're like, oh yeah, I guess we're all white, so that makes sense. They weren't looking at Aboriginal people, clearly. But post-1950, you had the Colombo Plan that introduced people to Asiatics for the first time. You had World War II refugees from the Pacific War, Indonesia, Philippines, who had been brought to Australia to avoid the conflict of World War II. And that was really significant because for the first time, Australians were introduced to these people. They actually met these people. Instead of seeing these horrible propaganda posters that painted them as these monsters, they actually got to meet these people, meet Asiatic people, and they were like, oh, they're just normal people, cool. It was a significant opportunity to address misconceptions and prejudices from wartime propaganda and xenophobia, which is a fear of immigrants, fear of foreigners. By the 1954 National Census, which is a big survey that basically says what's happening in the country, it showed that 14% of Australians were born overseas, which doesn't sound significant, but it's millions of people. And less than half were British. The government couldn't force different cultures and races to assimilate to act Australian when the meaning of being Australian was rapidly changing. Because if the government goes out and says, you guys need to be Australian, you need to act like everyone else, they start looking around, it's like, well, there's all these immigrants here, they're not Australian. Why are we acting like something we're not when you guys are no longer white? So this change in public perception, this change of the idea of what it means to be Australian, interacting, mingling with immigrants, mingling with Asiatics, led to a very different attitude in immigration. And the government, of course, has to represent the interests of the people. So if the people are saying this isn't right, the government has to change it. And that's what happened. That led to the 1958 Migration Act, a law that changed the way migration worked in Australia. So in 1901, when we created the Immigration Restriction Act, it forced all individuals attempting to migrate to Australia to pass a test. They had to pass a CAT to get into Australia. And this was called a dictation test. So basically, someone would be saying out some words, some phrases, and you would have to write down what they were saying. You would have to dictate what was being said. This assessed the literacy of all migrants. So they're reading, they're writing. However, the test was often written in a language not spoken by the individual. So I know that some of you guys take languages. I'm pretty sure that you guys would struggle to pass the dictation test if it was being given to you in Spanish. Not many of y'all probably speak Spanish fluently. They would legitimately just use this as a tool to send hundreds of people home. So they would look you up and down. They'd say, oh, you're from Italy, eh? I don't really like Italy. All right, just pass this dictation test in Spanish or French. And you could give it to them again. If miraculously this Italian bloke spoke Spanish, you could give him the test in another language. So this awful tool was used to send hundreds of people home. Authorities were allowed to refuse entry to people, essentially based on their racial origin. The 1958 Migration Act was significant because it eliminated the dictation test. That's why it was so impressive, which removed questions of race in immigration. So instead of focusing on what language you spoke or what country you were from, instead of allowing some border patrol bloke to send you off because he decided to give you, he picked into his hat and he was like, all right, you're going to take the test in Croatian. It was now focusing on your skills. So basically your merit. So you were being let into Australia if you were good at something, if you were skillful, if you had education, training. So how you should really be judged, your qualifications as the selection criteria. So before the Migration Act, It was this dictation test, 1958. We got rid of that. Race is removed as a question in immigration. Now it's all about the skills to pay the bills. In the 1960s, there was an increasing awareness of the challenges migrants found in adjusting to a new life, language, and culture. So again, as Australia's population changes, the feeling of the people changes. Because one, a lot of the people are now immigrants, and two, those immigrants interact with other Australian people who start to see them as people, not just foreigners. They see them as their neighbors, and they're like, wow, you guys are having a tough time. I wish you didn't have to assimilate. I wish you could have your own culture. So immigration policy started to shift from assimilation to something called integration, which supported migrants in maintaining some, but not all, but some elements of their previous culture. So you have to eat meat pies, but I'll let you speak Italian at home. Something like that. This period of history also coincided with a number of civil rights movements that led nations to distance themselves from racial discrimination practices. Basically, during the 1960s, it was this decade of great change. So that's a picture of me boy, Martin Luther King Jr. So you had the African-American civil rights movement, the US civil rights movement occurring that inspired one in Australia for Indigenous people, which we look at next term as well. So it was all these civil rights movements that basically led nations to be like, all right, racism isn't cool anymore. So you didn't want to be seen as racism, because then all the other countries in the world would be like, ooh, okay, I see how it is. So that led to a shift from assimilation to integration. In 1964, the government stated Australia would accept any migrants on humanitarian reasons. So that was really the official point where we said, all right, we will start accepting people if they need it. So refugees, basically, were allowed to come into Australia. It wasn't just, you have to be skillful. Now it was, okay, if you're in trouble, we'll let you in. The final step, so we're finally at the finish line, in dismantling the White Australia policy, about 72 years later, occurred in 1973. That's so recent. I mean, not to you guys, y'all are young, but like, I mean, I'm older than that. No, I'm younger than that. Anyway, it seems really recent to me. The final step occurred in 1973 as Prime Minister Gough Whitlam changed the national citizenship criteria to allow all migrants, regardless of race, to apply for Australian citizenship as long as they had lived in Australia for, I think it's 3 years. So that was significant as well, because now you could be considered a legitimate Australian citizen, formal, got a passport and everything. It says Australian on it, no matter what race you were. And that occurred in 1973, and that was officially the final nail in the coffin, the death knell of the White Australia policy. That changed to citizenship. So now we have migrants, and we have Australian citizenship for all migrants, regardless of race. Phew. All right then, 4 questions. For today's lesson. You don't need a textbook, you should just be using the slides really. You can go to the textbook if you need, but the information is hopefully in the slides. Question 1. Why do you believe the Colombo Plan? So we looked at that, I touched on it this lesson, but really that was last lesson. It was when Asian students were allowed to come into Australia and study at universities, study the culture. Why do you think the Colombo Plan and accepting Pacific War refugees from Indonesia, Philippines, Japan would change Australians' views on Asian migrants? I've said that we fear what we don't understand. And I've found that if you meet someone, if you understand them, that will greatly change your views. I've probably given you the answer there, but why do you believe the Colombo Plan and accepting Pacific War refugees would change Australian views on Asian migrants? Question 2. Why was the 1958 Migration Act significant? So what was the impact to Australian immigration policies and practices? Why was this an important law? Question 3. You've actually got part of the dictation test. So they keep these things, obviously these records, in museums and government offices. And this website, if you click on that and you click on the next link, it gives you an audio clip. So make sure you've got your sound on, and you have to write down what the audio is saying. And then once you've done that, you check on the next page. And if you've misspelled something, or if you misheard something, you fail, and you're not allowed into Australia. So you have to pack your bags, out you go. For the record, I failed as well. So don't feel bad if you don't pass the dictation test. Give it a shot though. So have your audio on, have a pen or your keyboard ready to start typing down what the person is saying. If you spell one thing wrong, if you mishear one thing, if there's a missing comma, you failed the test. Sorry, mate. Just giving you an idea of how difficult it was to pass the test, even if you know the bloody language. They're speaking in English, and I failed. But I'm not an English teacher. Anyway, question 4. What challenges do you believe that new migrants faced when they were asked to assimilate to Australian culture? So looking at the actual migrant experiences, think about what's important to culture, life, language, your practices, etc., etc. What challenges do you believe migrants faced when coming to Australia? Do you believe these challenges still occurred after the White Australia policy was eliminated in 1973? Why or why not? We haven't eliminated racism. It's still there. It still exists. Some people are still racists. We haven't really eliminated a fear of migrants. If you look at modern Australian refugee policies and practices, a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of dodgy individuals. So in your opinion, do you believe that migrants still face challenges when coming to Australia in modern times? So after we got rid of White Australia, did everything go back to, hooray, it's all good? Or are there still problems and challenges? And some of you might have personal experience with this. Some of you might be migrants yourself, or sons or grandsons or granddaughters of migrants. So you should probably shout across the living room and say, oi mum, have you had challenges yet? As a migrant. And that's what you're working on this lesson, guys. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. I will say, just as a final note, that I've finished marking the Year 10 history cuts, the World War II source analysis. The cat for this subject will be either week 1 or week 2 of term 4, and it will be another source analysis. And honestly, based on how you guys went with the World War II cat, I'm pretty confident you guys are going to smash it out of the park. I'm really happy with the majority of the results. I thought everyone did really, really well. Those of you that are not happy with your results, I'd ask you to take a deep breath and reflect upon what has happened this year and what has happened this semester and all the challenges that you have faced. To hell with migrants, you guys have had a lot of challenges this term. And I know that, again, all the students in this class are capable of improving upon their result for the next cat. So just read the feedback, ask me a few questions, and yeah, I think you guys will be, 1, sick of source analysis by the end of term 4, but 2, you'll be good at them. You'll really be able to improve for that next cat. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Just finish on a positive note. Best of luck, boys and girls. Hope you're well, and